Hi, and welcome to worship. My name is Michelle Hopp, and I serve the Arlington and the Poinette Inch United Methodist Churches. And I'm so glad to have you with me here today. I hope you've had a good week, and I am looking forward to sharing some wisdom about grace. This is inspired by the book from Max Lucado that's entitled Grace. And today, we're going to consider the facet of grace in which grace allows us to rest. And I think so many of us are on such a busy schedule that we think there's no way that rest can even be part of it. But that is what grace allows us, and we'll explore that a little bit more in depth. So I'd like to invite you to join me in an opening prayer. Holy God, your gift of grace cost you dearly, and too often I forget to focus on your sacrifice. Please renew my sense of wonder at your grace and help me rest in it. My heart should be strengthened by your grace, not by obeying rules. Amen. So let me ask you, how are you feeling today? And tell me the truth. How are you really feeling? I bet you're tired. I hear that all the time. I'm really, really tired. Parents tell me, oh, Michelle, I want to come to church, but Sunday's my only day off. I'm exhausted. It's so hard to get up. I hear older folks say, gosh, I want to come to church, but it takes me so long in the morning, and then I come into church late and then I'm embarrassed, and I'm just so tired. And some days when people ask me, how are you? I can see it in my face today in my camera. I'm tired. I've had a lot of days in a row without a day off in a while, and so this message is for me as well. My friends, we're tired. Many of us feel we're exhausted. But we learned something during the pandemic, didn't we? That we have quickly forgotten. We were reminded to slow down, to limit our activities to just those things that mattered for us with God and with our families. But as soon as the quarantines and those mask mandates lifted, one by one, almost all of us got back on that busyness treadmill that we were so glad to escape during the pandemic. And we are, once again, exhausted. We might recognize ourselves and our ancient counterparts, and these are the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. Now, you might not think you're quite this bad. However, let's learn from it. So, back in Egypt, Pharaoh's ego was huge, and his building projects bigger than his ego. And the enslaved Hebrew men, they were toiling under the sun. Their backs were blistering with sunburn because they never got a break. They couldn't leave the hot sun. Their throats were so parched because they couldn't drink water as often as they needed to. While they're working so hard, they're miserable, and their Egyptian taskmasters are whipping them. It was absolutely miserable. And the men were exhausted, and they saw no hope for rest. But God showed them a way out. He sent Moses to Pharaoh to negotiate their freedom. And in Exodus chapter 6, verse 6, we learn that God told Moses, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord. I'll bring you out from Egyptian forced labor. I'll rescue you from your slavery to them. I'm going to set you free with great power and with momentous events of justice. So Moses went and he visited that stubborn, egotistical Pharaoh. And after God's miracles of 10 plagues, and remember that parted Red Sea, the Hebrew people were finally free. They were happy. Well, for a hot minute, or more precisely, for a month. Soon as those Hebrew people, they were all wandering in the wilderness under Moses' leadership, they grew disgruntled. They got tired of eating that manna, and then even when God added in the quail, not good enough. They didn't like that. They reminisced about how good the food was under their slave masters. And the truth is, the food probably wasn't much better than bone broth, right? But these crazy people started to grumble, thinking about the good old days of slavery. Boy, we want to go back to that. They wanted to return. They wanted to leave God's rest in the wilderness and return to the busyness treadmill of Egypt. And what did Moses say to them? He said, "You foolish people, who put a spell on you?" Well, actually, Moses didn't say that. The Apostle Paul said that because his foolish church folk in Galatia were acting just like the Hebrew people. Both groups of people had been saved. Both were turning their backs on their freedom. Moses freed the Hebrews through God's miracles, but Christ freed his disciples through his death on the cross and his resurrection. Moses overpowered Pharaoh while Jesus defeated Satan. Moses opened the Red Sea while Jesus opened the grave. Jesus opened the path to total rest. No more law keeping, no more trying to get God's approval through good works. Jesus told his followers, "My friends, you can rest now." So they did, for a hot minute. But somewhere between Acts 2, where Peter gives that brilliant sermon telling about the history of Christianity and grace, and between Acts 2 and Acts 15, so what's that, 13 chapters? The people started to reminisce about the good old days of following rules to try to win God's favor. The thing is, they understood what grace was, but they began to think that grace was not enough. They wanted to add rules to God's grace. They felt that sometimes Jesus needed just a little bit of help. They added merits to their Christian sash, much like a scout adds merit badges to their scout uniform. I bet a lot of you were scouts growing up. I know I was. I remember being a Girl Scout and having one of those sashes that I wore over my uniform dress. I'd read the requirements for the next badge and then plan how I was going to earn the next badge. Then, when I got the badge, I'd ask my mom to sew them on my sash because apparently I was not interested in the sewing badge. Yeah, I still don't like to sew. But we were required to wear our scout uniforms to school, even though we were in public school, because our meetings were right after school every Wednesday afternoon. So we would proudly wear our uniforms and display our sashes for our classmates to see how wonderful we were. You know, as Christians, we get in trouble when we want to acquire merit badges at church. We often want to follow every rule because we think this will ensure our entry into heaven. But here's the sticking point about being a rule follower. How good is good? God expects us to be kind and honest with our speech. But what percentage of goodness is going to get us into heaven? You know, when I try to sew a button on my pants or try to hem my jeans or whatever, and I stick my finger with the needle and I curse, does that take points off my score? So let's say you need an 80% of goodness to get into heaven, and then my cursing and lack of sewing ability gets me down to a 79, so now I can't go to heaven? Is that how this works? Darn sewing, darn cussing. How good is good? Do we always have to be better, do more, do it all now? I'm exhausted just saying that sentence. And what does doing good look like to you? It's different for all of us, isn't it? Paying your taxes on time, or praying every day, or being honest, or going to church every week, or staying sober. How do you earn your merit badges? And when is your good enough? You know, we tend to return to our busyness treadmill instead of resting in God's grace. But God has a better way. What did Paul write to those foolish church folk in Galatia? He wrote, well, actually, this is from Ephesians, so he had trouble in more than one church. So Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 9 says, "Grace is all God's idea and all his work. All we do is trust him. We have to trust him enough to let him do it. It's God's gift from start to finish. We don't play a major role, because if we did, we'd probably go around bragging that we did the whole thing." Wow, Paul knew human nature, didn't he? I can imagine Paul shaking his head at his crazy church folks who are slipping back into rule following instead of enjoying God's grace and rest. He's telling them the same message that Moses told the Hebrews. Say no to working in the hot sun with a whip to your back. Say no to slavery and rule following. Jesus has redeemed, saved, and freed you with God's grace. Don't you understand what this means? You know, my friends, I think this is a human tendency. The Hebrews didn't trust God's grace. Early Christians struggled to trust God's grace, even though they understood it even better. And when we willingly enter back into the treadmill of busyness to earn God's approval, we fail to trust God's grace. Why are we so exhausted? Well, because we just don't trust God. We don't trust God's grace. We don't think that we can take time to rest. But it might help us to look at a story from 2010 of the ordeal of 33 Chilean miners who were trapped under 2,000 feet of solid rock. Oh my goodness. To me, that sounds like the worst nightmare. I get a little claustrophobic, and just the thought of being trapped in anything, but especially under rock, underground where it's dark. Oh my goodness. So the main tunnel had collapsed, leaving no way out. For 2 months, the miners lived in survival mode. They were praying for a rescue, and they shared their remaining food. Get this, they ate a little teeny micro meal every other day, which was 2 spoonfuls of tuna, a few peach slices, and a sip of milk every other day. And meanwhile, on the surface 2,000 feet above, the rescue team consulted with NASA and other experts. They drilled a communication hole first so they could talk to the guys. And then they worked on a rescue tunnel. And then they built a capsule that they could put into the rescue tunnel to be able to rescue the men. It was 13 feet tall. The miners prayed, and the world prayed. Do you remember watching that on the news back in 2010? Nobody had ever survived being trapped underground for 2 months before, so success wasn't guaranteed. But this group of 33 men, they defied the odds. Finally, the men, one by one, they went into that capsule and they were pulled to ground. These included a 19-year-old man with his future ahead of him, a 44-year-old man planning to get married, and a grandfather. All kinds of different people were among those 33 men. And as they shared their stories, it was clear they had all made the decision, the same decision. They couldn't save themselves. So they trusted that the people on the surface of the earth would be able to save them. Why can't we do that? Why can't we just rest and know that God is going to save us? Why do we keep trying to save ourselves? And why can't we see the results of this farce? We are the most exhausted people on earth. A pandemic paused us, but we have quickly returned to our old tricks. Let's stop this frenzy for good. Jesus didn't tell us, come on, come to me, all of you hard workers who are perfect and sinless. Jesus didn't say that. What did he say instead? Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Grace means you can rest now. And my friends, it is time. It is time. Let's get off that busyness treadmill. I'm talking to myself now too. Get off this busyness treadmill. You don't have to earn God's love because you already have it. Remember what grace means. You are loved and you can rest now. I'd like to send you out into your week, which I hope is restful. I hope that you realize you do not have to run in this rat race that many of us are choosing to run. You know how to slow down. You did it during the pandemic. Let's just be intentional and try to be more restful and less frenzied. The love of God, The grace of Jesus Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all today and always. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Amen.